Go ahead. Can't hear you. Can't hear you.
Okay, now?
Yes.
Right. So, right, the Green New Deal, they seem to be the first ones to have used the phrase, but it seems to be a thought experiment, especially in the 2000s. There's very little political traction. I don't know if there's an actual bill, but it's been presented by a bunch of thinkers, politicians, industry leaders who came together and proposed this. And essentially, it has five basic tenets, and they seem to be the same as we're seeing elsewhere. And the main thing that they're calling for is decarbonizing.
Can't hear you.
Yeah, I've lost it.
Yeah, I think Aparajita, you lost. You're frozen on my screen. I'm just going to go from left to right. I'm guessing Tarun, the BP climate is you. So maybe you can just take us through that while we wait for Aparajita to come back.
Yeah, sure. She's not back. Okay. Um, okay, yeah. So this is basically about BP had an announcement publicized. They had an initial announcement in February of this year about they have a net zero target of with a deadline of the year 2050. They've now set themselves a target for the year 2030, where they've basically committed to reducing production by 40%. That's and also terminating. Is it possible to zoom into some of the? I mean, I know it's very. I haven't figured out the knack of making these crisper, but yeah, it's the point of that little extract from their announcement webpage is there's a lot of stuff. They'll announce a lot of stuff, but there's some things we need to zoom in on, and the production decline by 40%, and the no exploration in new countries is really the critical new material here, and. Especially when you compare it against some of the previous announcements by especially oil majors, uh, which have used this kind of net zero language. Net zero, obviously, to some extent, has been popularized by the IPCC's special report on 1.5 degrees, which came out in 2018 and said the planet needs to be in net zero emissions, greenhouse emissions by the year 2050. And after that, go into negative emissions for a couple of years, although people talk about that a little less. But anyway, yeah, so this is significant because it's different from announcements by oil majors prior. So do you mind just moving to the right a little bit? So the examples of the sort of fudges that have been used before, of course, the classic example is British Petroleum itself in the early 2000s, 2005, where they started this Beyond Petroleum campaign, and it turned out to be they put up a couple of nice logos on their whatever oil pumps, and they committed to investing in renewable energy. But that wasn't the commitment to reduce their investments in fossil fuels, oil and natural gas. Uh, that was one variety of fudge. A similar fudge is basically when a company announces its targets in terms of emissions intensity of its products, where they're saying if you take into account the total amount of energy generated by all our products and divided by the amount of emissions that they generate, it's going to go down in the future. But again, that basically means they're going to add some renewable energy investment. It doesn't mean they're going to, in absolute terms, reduce the amount of fossil investments they have. An example of that was Total, I believe the French company, which they put out an announcement earlier this year in terms of emissions intensity. The second fudge broadly is limiting reduction targets to emissions from operations. So this is stuff like uh, you know, burning of excess natural gas from operations, or just in terms of the machinery that's used to extract products, etc. But not committing to reducing their emissions impact from the products they sell to consumers. So they're not taking any responsibility for the fact that consumers are burning oil that they extract. They're simply saying our emissions are this much and we're going to reduce them. This ties into sorry, maybe I should have started from here, but if you go a little north, uh, there's a link to, it's a little further than that, something called Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions. And there's a link to the what is known as the greenhouse gas protocol. And Scope 1 is basically your own operations. Scope 2 is your own operations plus the electricity that you use, the emissions impact of that. Scope 3 is basically the big chunk of a corporate entity's emissions impact, where it's the impact of their products as used by consumers. So Scope 3 can often account for about even 90% of a company's actual emissions impact in the world. And very few announcements extend to Scope 3 until this BP one. Sorry, I'll just cover the other two examples very quickly of fudges, and we can then move on. Three, Total has an announcement earlier this year where they basically said we're committing to X% by 2030, etc. It's not a new commitment. It's simply them complying with the European Union Green New Deal, which is already becoming a bunch of policies and legislation. So it's not, they're not adding any ambition above that. They're just saying we're going to comply with national policies. And lastly, this is not so much oil companies, but there are a bunch of companies which obviously when they say we're going to reduce our emissions impact, what they mean is we're going to buy carbon offsets to kind of write off the impact, which is in theory fine, except you have to be you have to pay close attention to where are those offsets coming from, what are the standards used to generate them, and whether it's truly what is known in whatever climate politics as an additional emissions reduction, or whether it's simply generating emissions reductions out of thin air. So in comparison to these fudges, BP announcing that it's going to effectively cut production by 40% by 2030 seems like, okay, that's very direct, on point. We're going to reduce the amount of polluting product that we are putting out in the world. So that's clearly better. The only caveat to that I would urge us to think about is, okay, what was their business as usual projection for 2030? The oil price is currently under sea level, or it was at least in March. It's recovered a little bit. And there's a general consensus among a lot of players in this industry that current levels of production cannot stay as they are. You have to cut back production if you have to see profit. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that BP was going to anyway slash production by 40% by 2030. But I would imagine that has factored into their thinking in part. So, yeah.
Great. Thanks, Tarun. And we can go back to your Prajita. So wait a sec. Let's see if I can. There you go. There you are. Can't hear you.
Every time. So as I was saying, the main principle or what they're calling for is decarbonizing the economy, and according to them, decarbonizing the economy will also lead to a more resilient economy. So this argument was particularly raised, especially after 2008. So it sort of fell silent in the middle as far as I can tell, but in recent years, because of the youth-led climate action movement, and now the economic downturn because of COVID, and I'm guessing to some extent Brexit also, the Green New Deal movement in UK is sort of seeing a resurgence, and it's been getting some political mileage, although not as much as in the US. Yeah.
Thanks, Prajita. So let's see if I can Northeast.
Yeah. So I just wanted to set the context as to where I'm coming from and where my perspective is coming from, since we don't have other Northeast participants right now. So I have actually attached links to the file. Can you click on it? Yeah. So yeah, so I know we just discussed so many high level deals and all these conversations that take place on such a high level. But what I'm going to talk about is something that is so personal to people who belong to indigenous communities, such as myself. And so I were you able so I actually belong to this community, and we've been standing up against dam construction in the Tista River for more than like decades now. And so we talk about dams every single day in our lives, in our households. And there has been a lot that our community has done. And I think this stands true for everybody who belongs to any indigenous community. And anybody from Northeast will come with this perspective that I come with, although there may be differences here and there. So this article talks about how Zongo is like the natural reserve for Lepchas in Sikkim, and it talks about basically how all the village heads, they've come together, and despite belonging to different political groups and different ideologies, they've decided that they will all oppose the dam. So this is just one article that talks about it. Of course, I have criticisms even about this article, because articles, papers, and workshops, they're very biased, and they only talk about things that they think the participants want. So this article is talking about how indigenous communities are in the forefront, but in reality, we also have people who want development. We also have people who have taken money, in exchange for development. So that is something that I have like tried to look for papers, publication thesis. I don't find that in a lot of publications. These are things that I would not say in like I've worked with international think tanks and with national level organizations. I would not say in those platforms either. So it's very important that we take all these things into consideration when we go about in our research, especially when we talk about Northeast, because of course, indigenous communities are in the forefront of climate change, and they do oppose like a lot of things. But at the same time, we also have many different viewpoints within the group. And I think we should get that clear from the very beginning as well, even though we may not discuss it in publications, even though I may not write articles about it. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about was climate justice and whose burden is it anyway. There's also this article that I found many years ago. I didn't. It's basically about how since the Paris Agreement, there's been a lot of money invested in fossil fuel. So it really brings the question about whose burden is this anyway. You have like people working in the grassroots.
I can't.
Can you hear me? Hello.
I can hear you. Yeah, I can't read the story because I need to sign in, supposedly.
Okay. So it basically talks about how there's been a lot of money invested in fossil fuels since the Paris Agreement. So we sort of like see how, things really don't sort. I mean, a workshop is not the success story of, like how action is going to be taken forth. I've attended many workshops, and I've met people who lead big organizations, and I've thought to myself that, oh wow, like this person's carbon footprint is bigger than my entire village's carbon footprint, and here is this person talking about like climate action. So I've thought about that. And so so that's my view. Also, I think that lastly, we need to have like a 360-degree perspective when we are studying or analyzing climate change and climate action and any community, because it's not just climate that we need to look into. We also need to look into people's aspiration. This article actually it talks about how despite the dam construction, people have started coming up with their own initiatives to like homestays and agriculture and even movies. So people, they try to make the best out of the worst, but also it shows how aspirations are rising. This is something that I keep talking about, that people don't want to stay in villages forever, and people don't want, there's more to people than just protecting the nature. We all have aspirations. So I think we need to look into development and equitable development, because it's not a and even equitable climate burdens. I think it cannot be distributed equally. Climate burdens cannot be distributed equally. It has to be done. I mean, we were taught about plastic, not using plastic when we were in junior school. I remember we went to town, we had to, it was part of a school exercise to go to the town and tell people not to use plastic. And this is something we did when we were in class 5. So we've had this conditioning for such a long time. But at the same time, it's not like, I mean, I'm able to talk to you because of technology. I have Wi-Fi in my household, but it's not a privilege that everybody has. So I think when we talk about, like, especially the Northeast, we cannot go at the same pace as the other regions, and we also cannot be expected to make sacrifices like people from like other urban areas or regions. So I just wanted to set that context. I'm sure there'll be a lot of other people from Northeast who disagree with me, and that's great too, but this is my perspective. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, so let's see if there's any other. So this is one of the challenges of Mural, is that this, let's see, yeah. So that was BP, this is, oh, that's it. Oh, there's one more thing here, yeah.
Yeah, I have something very small to kind of add. So I think in the past week, the Global Green Growth Institute just put out a report on greening the post-COVID-19 economy. And this is just an article that summarizes it, but they link through to the bigger report. And I think it's interesting. So it mentions the South Korean Green New Deal, which is where I came across it in the first place, but it's also just talking about what post-COVID-19 recoveries might look like and how they might pivot more towards this. I will preface it by saying I am skeptical of the Green Growth Institute, and follow heavily in Abhijita's footsteps about degrowth being very absent from this report or considerations. But from their perspective, they're kind of interested in what green recovery can look like for cities. They think that has one of the biggest potentials in the post-COVID-19 recovery, and all of the different subsections of the urban economy that can be, or urban planning that can be changed. And in fact, they've actually researched, I think, Green New Deal since 2008. I couldn't find the report, but they were talking about how it would be great if the green elements in New Deals outweigh the brown elements, because their main criticism was that all of these Green New Deals say that they're green on the surface, but then you actually kind of dig deeper and you realize that the brown elements are more, and just because they have 5 green elements, it seems more green. And actually that's one of the big criticisms that is, I'm continuing to read up more in the South Korean case, where it's basically kind of a rehashing of an old green growth policy that the predecessors had already instituted. And so people are quite upset that that's being called a Green New Deal when it's much more of a green growth kind of neoliberal sustainability edged way of looking through some of these things. So I just thought that was interesting, and interesting how cities may be co-opted when they need to be actually the sites where perhaps degrowth happens the most. And I'm curious about whether that would apply to Indian cities as well. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Thanks.
Cool, thank you. Wow, this was quite the learning session today. And I've recorded most of it. So with your permission, I can share that with others, and maybe we can even edit it down and share it with the world. Tarini, you had a question, I think, for Chaya in the chat.
Yes, I was just wanting her to say more about the jobs that dams may or may not create for local economies, and if big development is seen as like a job creator, or if it's seen more as a hindrance to, because like who's actually working in the dam company and in the dams? Is it local people or not?
So the dams, they do not generate any vacancy. When I was working on a different project on the Teesta River, I was working as a researcher, and the local communities, they told me that even the sweepers are brought in from outside. So there's no vacancy on all levels. And I think they do it on purpose so as to make sure that there's no interaction and nothing. We also have tea gardens where we live, and the managers, the people who head the tea gardens are never local, like they're not local people. They're always strategically brought in from outside, so that power dynamic and power hierarchy is maintained really well. So there's no information sharing as well.
It's a very old colonial
Yes,
period.
yes, 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 exactly.
So, um,
So that's why now we have a lot of homestays coming up, because that's the only way a lot of people can get make money apart from waiting for government jobs. So it's, you either become a contractor, you become, you know, like you side with the political leader, become a contractor, you have a government job, or you open a homestay.
uh, very interesting. We'll have to delve into this deeper, I think, in the future, as in actually what are the things. Aprajita, we can't hear you.
I do want to just mention that from my experience with hydropower projects, this is a tactic that is universal to every single public, private hydropower developer that I have seen. Is that jobs is the first thing that sort of starts making the rounds. Like that is the rumor on ground before a project even starts in the place. When it's first proposed, that is the first thing that you'll hear going around, that jobs are going to be created. And that's a very common tactic to get support for the project itself. And then, I mean, obviously, as Chaya pointed out, they never manifest. Or if they do, then they're usually labor jobs, or not something that pays very well, not something you're going to progress much at.
It was the same for Amazon as well, right? Them getting rebate in New York. The logic that behind that was given for it was that it'll generate jobs.
I mean, generating jobs is the oldest capitalist um, propaganda in the world, right? I mean, it's whether it works or not is a different question, but
Yeah.
it seems to be wherever there is a development project, you'll say yes, jobs. Okay, let's not get too far into our version of propaganda. Thank you everybody for joining, and we will wait. Let me stop the recording first, and then we'll go.